Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining. This is Joy Allen, Customer Success Manager out of the Michigan office. We have with us today Charles Fox, who's going to be presenting on CollectD. I did just want to call to your attention that this session will be recorded, so if you have questions, you can just use the chat window and we'll get those questions answered. And I will follow up with the recording in email so that you can reference back to it. And with that, Charles, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Allen. Appreciate your assistance as always. Today's topic is CollectD. Quickly, a little bit about myself. My name is Charles Fox. I am one of the Customer Success Program Managers here at NetApp, and just if you're here, you're probably at least familiar with the program. We are the post-sales guys who attempt to provide enablement and service to you guys after the sale, and try and address customers' needs and issues, and hopefully this session will be a vehicle to do that. I turned the video on. I'm not going to leave it on. It's a bandwidth hog, but we do want to prove that we're real people. I'm here at in my garage in Conifer, Colorado, surrounded by microchips and bitmine coiners and all kinds of interesting things that make me happy. So CollectD, which is our topic today, was actually a lot of fun because it's kind of a more technical component. That, and one thing I discovered when I put this together was that there is not a whole lot of good information on CollectD provided by us or anyone else for that matter. In fact, internet search on CollectD and OCI will get you the GitHub site for this plugin, and that's about it. So hopefully this session, which is really kind of a conglomeration of me setting this up and getting it to work, I discovered all kinds of interesting pitfalls and maybe some holes in what little documentation there is there. And hopefully this session will allow you to get some experience with CollectD without going through all the hassles that I went through, and hopefully will save you some time. So that being said, I am going to stop the video, like I said, for the sake of bandwidth. Let's turn that off. Hold on one moment here while I turn this off. There we go. PowerPoint's a little funny about taking control of the screen. All right. That should do it. Okay. First of all, what is CollectD, and why did we decide to use this open source component with OCI? It's interesting because it's a little bit of a departure from what we tout as some of the beauties of OCI, in that CollectD is essentially an agent. It has been around for a while. CollectD was not developed by NetApp. We certainly don't want to take credit for that. It is a open source product that has been around for quite some time with many, many contributors in the community. But it is essentially an agent. It's a collection daemon that gets all kinds of interesting information from the outside world. Well, we touted one of the big things about OCI is that it is agentless, and that is a very good thing. However, we also discovered that there are situations that having an agent to collect information and provide metrics and things like that probably would be a good thing. Now, of course, that does come with the downside of agents, is that you have to put code on your target machine that you want to measure and maintain it and that sort of thing. So it's not without its faults, but it does enable certain scenarios and certain collection of information that otherwise would be outside of OCI's purview. And mainly things like operating system information is probably the most common thing in CollectD. And application information, log files, etc. You can see that there. Why did we pick this? Its popularity, its open source design. There are dozens of plugins for it. It's relatively lightweight, so it can be used on systems even with limited resources. And it's a performing component, and in general, a bit of an industry standard, and a lot of people have done a lot of work, so why not leverage it? Now, before we get into CollectD, and most of what I'm going to show today is how to obtain it, how to install it, how to verify that it's working, and a little bit of how to use it on the actual console itself. This first bullet is important. This is not a data source. If you're familiar with working in OCI, you know that data sources are arrays and hosts and vCenter components and things like that we pull data from and collect. This does not install as a data source, and that is significant because I'll be honest, when I first got into this and started reviewing this for this session, I just assumed that it was a data source like any other, and you just add it and be able to work with it. Well, it doesn't work that way, and it uses a different mechanism. It uses the REST API, so it is not defined as a data source, and that has some interesting repercussions later when we talk about how to use this in the system. This is a complementary tool to bring data into OCI. Obviously, there's the normal mechanisms, but this can bring in statistics and data that normally, like I said, would be outside of the purview of the data collectors that and the data sources that the NetApp team writes. We are, at least the plan is, from what I understand, is to make the source code for this available. So the plan is to open source this. I think parts of it are already available on GitHub. I'm not sure that the whole thing has been open source yet, but that is the plan. What we've essentially done is taken CollectD's daemon with its plugin architecture and all of its neat stuff, and wrapped it with a Python callback to the REST API within OCI. And so that's the mechanism to put it in. Installation, we'll go through that. We'll actually demo that. And see, that it's relatively simple to put this in. It is a detailed process, and that, like most command line things and the like, you have to be very careful to get all the bits and pieces right. This is designed to work with release 7.3.2. It is my understanding that it will work with earlier releases, but you have limited capabilities in terms of data presentation that were released in 7.3.2. So officially, that is the supported release, that or anything higher. Where do you get this thing? It is the only official place to get it right now is its GitHub repository, and you can see the URL right there. You will find README installation guides and things like that we'll take a look at. Mind you, I discovered that the documentation and things in that repository, which is the only official guides to installing this, are a little light and somewhat misleading at times. Prerequisites to doing this. First of all, Python 2.7 is called out as a requirement. This isn't usually a big deal in most of the modern distros. For instance, I use CentOS 7 to do my demonstration on, which we'll see shortly. Has Python 2.7 already installed. However, if your distribution is a minimalist one, is stripped down or whatever, and it doesn't have that pre-installed, that's something that is required. Internet access is required for installation. This is kind of true. Internet access is required as the instructions call out using wget, the HTTP transfer command line, to get the code and bring it to your local machine. If you can get around that, if you want to do that some other way because your machine doesn't have internet access, so long as you can get the code down onto your machine, that's the only real internet access required. Secure Linux or SELinux is not supported. This is pretty significant because if you try and install it on an SE-enabled, security-enabled Linux system, it will not install right, and the installer is going to catch that and tell you you need to turn that off. If you attempt to use it on an SE-enabled system, CollectD does do kernel-level operations, and consequently, it doesn't like SELinux turned on. Supported distributions and versions are listed here. I won't read them all off. I'm sure you're all capable of looking at it yourselves. But as you can see, most modern distributions, it probably will work on other distributions as well. It's just these are the only ones we tested them on. But it's pretty straightforward. CollectD is very nicely written to be awfully generic in its design. So I suspect it will work on more than these versions, but that's officially what we have to say. So to do all this, step one is install your Linux distribution. And installing a Linux distribution isn't really not what we want to focus on today, but we'll just talk a little bit about it as it is a starting point. How you install your distribution, of course, is how you get it, where you want to put it on, what media you want to use. Okay, so let's go on the assumption that you have a working distribution that you want to install CollectD on. Update accordingly. Verify your network connectivity. I've spent many an hour only to discover that I didn't bring up the network interface and that I couldn't get to things and couldn't understand why. So simple but important check. Prerequisites, is Python 7.2 installed? As I said, it is by default on CentOS, and you could skip that step. And why is this important? I mentioned that the installation instructions are a little vague at times. The installation instructions actually have you go out and run a Python program to set up the configuration on a machine, and then they tell you, you need to have Python 7.2 installed, and if not, here's what you need to do. Well, that order's backwards. You obviously can't run the installation program without having Python installed first. So the directions can throw you. Again, it works most of the time because Python 7.2 tends to be the default. But if it isn't installed right, it's the wrong version, you may end up with a failed client install. It should catch that. The installer is pretty smart, should catch that, but I don't think it gets all the corner cases. So Python first, then step it. That's not what the instructions say. Just make sure that you have that right. If you have an old version of Python or you need to install a different 7.2 version of Python on your distribution, here's a link to a community tutorial on how to do that. That in itself is an entire session, so we're going to do that today. But that'll give you instructions on how to install version-specific bits of Python on your machine to get yourself going. Okay, a little bit of demonstration here. Let's go to my virtual machine, and let's take a look at our system. This is a CentOS 7, latest version. I downloaded it a couple days ago. How we check if Python's installed, pretty simple, easy way to do it. You just invoke the Python interpreter. If it's installed, we could see here Python 7.2.5. That's a default installation on CentOS. That's an easy way to determine if it's there. We don't seem to have issues with point versions, if you're 0.3, 0.5, etc. I tried it on a couple of systems. That didn't seem to make much difference. I think it's 2.7 that's important. So that's an easy way to determine if you've got it there. Again, pretty straightforward, pretty easy to understand. So quick bit on how to make Python look. Okay. SELinux. I mentioned earlier, not supported. I will tell the developers that that's not acceptable. I know a lot of people, SE is kind of a requirement for certain individuals, especially in sites where you maybe got a lot of internet-facing components and things like that. It's as much the fact that CollectD runs with root-level privileges to collect kernel information, so we can blame some of it on CollectD's initial architecture. If we can come up with ways around this in the future, we will. We realize that's a problem, but it is what it is. Now, we've determined that SELinux is not supported. Most recent distributions, including my CentOS 7 version that we just showed, have this turned on by default, so that when you do your installation, SELinux is switched on. The easiest way to tell is with the SE status command. That's secure SE status, it gives you the status. It should be available on any system that's got SELinux installed on it. And I'll show you how to change it. If you're a smart guy and are familiar with SELinux, there is a command line option called set enforce. And a lot of people go, oh, okay, so you want me to turn it off because the installer doesn't like it or whatever, and you can use set enforce to 0, which means turn off the SELinux extensions. That'll get you through the installation. The minute you reboot your machine, it comes up, CollectD will fail to run. So just turning it off and then turning it back on at the next reboot is not going to work. So you need to permanently disable it, and that's by editing the etc system config SELinux file. You got to be super user to edit this file, as it's it's a system level file. It's important, so obviously. You've got to be super user to edit with Nano or VI or whatever. If you don't do this, if you ignore all my warnings here and go out and just try to run the install anyways, the installer will catch this, and it will say SELinux is enabled, installation aborted. But it will just waste your time. So let's move on here and take a look at how you actually do that. So we're going back to our virtual machine here with CentOS on it. And let's take of course you got to type it right. Never remembers. That's not it. Oh shoot! Get my own commands here. What was it? Set enforce. Okay, so we'll check that out back again. So this will give you the options on that. If you set it again, this is where you could set it to 0 or 1. Let's edit. Well, remember, if you're going to edit these files, you're going to need to have super user privileges. Let me make sure I got my path right. etc sysconfig SELinux. So let's go take a look at that. Okay, that's the file. This line here is what enables or disables the SELinux options. Notice here I've got it disabled. By default, when it's installed, it's going to say enforcing. And you want to change that to disabled and file that, and then you do have to do a reboot for that to take effect. But that's how you change it, and as I mentioned, it won't work right if you don't have that set. So that is an important little detail that you need to look at. Okay. Next steps. Getting this stuff onto the machine to actually do the installation. This is where it says you require internet connection, is we're using wget, which is just the sort of the command line HTTP component, which allows us to access and download things, put them on your machine. If you don't have internet connection, so long as you can go out and get the setup.py, the Python file from GitHub, and take this guy and get it on your machine, you're good. But this is the documented way of doing it. It's relatively easy to do. Then the next thing you want to do is make sure that you set it up for execution. As it comes down, it's just a file. You have to use chmod plus X, which means executable, on setup.py to set it as an executable file for when we want to run it. Don't run it right after you get it down. You don't have all the information required to run the setup. And again, the instructions are not super clear on the order to do these things. You need the security token for it to do the setup. And again, the instructions imply, oh, just do chmod and then run this. Well, you won't have the token, and you won't be able to pass it the right command line parameters. So don't run it yet. Now, if nothing else, you take away from today's discussion, buried nugget of knowledge here. Don't use the admin account. I'm bad about this. I'm as bad as everyone else. When I do these things on test systems, and I don't necessarily worry too much about security and things like that, what do you use? Admin 123, right? That's the default stuff when I build a new OCI system. Well, I spent a considerable amount of time trying to do that, only to discover that setup just hung, and it would never come back. And I thought, okay, I got wrong versions installed, this, that, and the other thing. Turns out, admin account won't work. Not really sure why. That's beyond my knowledge, but I wasted a considerable amount of time. So I created a user. I just called him API user. You can call him anything you want. Doesn't appear to have anything specific to the name. To interact with the REST API. Password admin123, the default stuff, doesn't work. And it doesn't give you any interesting error messages to the effect that you shouldn't use that account. Huge time waster here. Please save yourself the pain that I did on this. Okay. Whoops. Next, I talked a little bit about the token. The token is a security construct that is granted by the OCI server to allow access to the REST API. This thing is generated when you make a request. You run a convoluted command line, which we'll show you in a second, that makes a request to the server and says, hey, I'm going to register myself on the machine. Please give me a token that uses to identify myself when I make calls. If you do this multiple times, in other words, if you go install it and say, oh, that was interesting, I want to make sure I have it right, I'm going to do the installation again. Each time you do this thing, it generates a different token, even though you're setting it for the same set of parameters. This is significant because, once again, if you're like me, and I practiced this a couple of times, so I at least appeared to know what I was doing when I did the session, you'll get a different token every time you run it. So you can reset the one you already created, and just be aware of that. The token is completely obfuscated. It's this big, long set of numbers and letters. I strongly suggest that you accept the fact that if you're like me, you can't type 26 random upper lowercase characters and get it correct. In which case, I strongly suggest you use cut and paste. We'll show that in a second to get it correctly installed. Last, you see the convoluted URL. The best way to obtain this is to clip it out of the installation instructions, or I suppose you could clip it out as presentation. You have to get this exactly right. Notice the substitution of username and password. This would be my API user and password. It's -u, no space, username, :password. That's got to be exactly right, and space, HTTPS, et cetera, et cetera. OCI server is the IP address or DNS name of the OCI server. You got to get that all in just right, or the command will fail. And it's, again, syntax-wise doesn't make a lot of sense, so cut and paste is probably another good thing to do here. So let's go back to my VM and take a look at what we've got. We've got enough time, I think, that I can, I believe I've got the installation URL. I built it. Yeah, I don't have that one here. All right. SELinux disabled. Let's go with just taking a look at what's here already. Okay. You'll notice setup.py is already there. Let's see if I have it in my command line options here. I may have had it. No, I'd have to type it all in again. All right, well, that's okay. Let's go back to we should have this on the instructions. Now I'll pull those up. This is the actual instructions. I'm going to go cut and paste out of that. You'll see where I got some of the information. Let's do the pull and the setup. Take those, and we should now be able to go back. Hopefully, I think we can paste that in. Oh, no, it's not going to do that. All right. Well, all right. It's not important. That command, the command that's here in the instructions, that gets it. That will download it, and chmod +y will +x setup.py will change the make that into a runnable file, and that's pretty straightforward. I don't think anybody's going to need to figure out how to do that. Curls or wget's pretty easy to use. Now, let's go back and run. Okay, I'm going to run the token grab connection. I should have that here. If not, I'll have to cut it again. Okay, that's that long X post. This is what sends out the request to get a token. Now, you'll notice that I have made the substitutions. I've got the user's API user password. Gee, once again, security guy here is violating his own rules. Say user ID and the password are the same. The ID of the server and the rest of the string. Now let's see what happens. Okay, when we run that, we get back this nice little JSON file. The other information is largely extraneous. What you're really interested in is this token ID. And I said, if you run this multiple times, you're going to get different tokens for this description of the data. Now, my understanding is if you wanted to do this 10 or 12 or 15 different times, you can change the descriptions, I think, and use it on multiple interfaces. But let's take this token. Whoops, make sure I get all of it. And cut that out, not inclusive of the quotes. For those of you Unix types, you'll notice that I am using KConsole. That's because it supports cut and paste, whereas the Xterm doesn't seem to do that quite as well. So if you're going to get in there and do that, it's something you might want to think about. Let's get the setup. Okay. Notice super user, current directory, setup.py. There's the host name and our token. I'm going to paste in. It's the last parameter. All right, there's my mouse. Edit. Paste that guy in. Okay, so it's doing the actual setup. It's got the token ID. What it's doing now is going out and it's making sure that it's got the dependencies for the Python libraries and things like that that are required above Python 2.7. I said, remember, you can do this without internet connection. This also requires internet connection for this standpoint. However, if you want to do it without internet connection, you just need to remember that when you do the Python install, that you get these Python packages installed as well. Okay, that's Python pip, setup tools, unzip, curl, CollectD, Python. Some of those may be installed by default, some won't, but certainly the CollectD-Python won't be. So just make sure that we get those libraries installed as well. Now, you'll notice that it enabled and says it's running. Okay. So it went out, enabled the daemon, and started it up. So at this point, you're registered, and it should be collecting data. So that's all goodness. Go back here, and we'll get to the last slide. Okay, I got the thing running. How do I use it in OCI? This threw me for a while because I'll give you some background on it because I think it's useful. One, remember, it's not a data source. So this creates an interesting situation. If you're like me, I have all this neat equipment at home. I have 36 cores of processors sitting down in the garage waiting to be used. My NetApp has become increasingly internally security conscious, which, mind you, is a very good thing. I'm not knocking it. But they have made it increasingly difficult for us to install software on our personally owned machines and things like that, plus access to internal builds that are connected to EMC arrays and things like that. They don't particularly enjoy us hacking around with that. So I wanted to set up a system at home here to make this work. Well, I fired up a VM and installed OCI. And surprise, surprise, I don't happen to have an EMC Symmetrics or Hitachi HDS here, or even a NetApp filer for that matter. So I fired it up and went into OCI and said, okay, I'm going to make a dashboard and I'm going to put this data on it. Well, OCI won't let you do that without defining at least one data source that successfully collects. So I was stuck in this catch-22. I'm staring at it going, all right, I have OCI, I have CollectD running, and it's putting data into my server, yet I don't have any data source that I can pull. And I went down the path of, oh, well, I'll create a host and monitor that host. Well, to do that, that host usually needs to be virtualized under vCenter or KVM, something like that, where there's an API that OCI talks to get the information from the hypervisor manager in. So I couldn't use that route, and I was kind of stuck. And then I thought of something that is again, it's a sidebar here, but it's still interesting. There is a simulator for ONTAP available for download from NetApp. And I said, well, geez, maybe that would give me at least something that looked like a NetApp filer. So I went out and I installed that on VM Player. It also works on VMware if you happen to have an ESX machine and vCenter to install it. But anyways, even a simple situation, there's the VM Player. And I went out and I fired up the ONTAP simulator, which is relatively easy to do. Now, I'm not an ONTAP expert, so I kind of muddled my way through creating volumes and things like that. Ran that as a data source, and lo and behold, OCI took it and ran with it. So the API that OCI uses works in the simulator, and I was able to get a workable data source that did inventory. That allowed me to move forward and create dashboards. If you've got a production test system or whatever in your world, you don't have to worry about this. But if you're like me and you want to do all this at home, this is a really neat trick to get you up and running. And that way you can muck around with your own OCI installation, destroy it, do whatever you want, and not upset your production buddies. So that is a little something I learned. Create a dashboard and then put a widget on it. The data surfaces within the widgets, and we'll show this to you in a minute. Once you do and put the widget in and you can see what options to display, the CollectD data sources should show up as options. And we'll take a look at how this works. Because it's just a little odd the way you surface it in OCI itself. So let's go back to my virtual machines here. Let us switch from our Linux system to our OCI server. And a couple of things I wanted to show on here. You'll notice this is set up in users. This is real OCI. This is live. I notice I created my API user. I did make him an admin. I don't think that's necessary. I believe he can simply be a user because all the pulls from CollectD, at least to the REST API, we abstract that. The REST API, I believe they're all available as user options. So I'm not sure he has to be administrator. I made him administrator and it worked. So just something to know. Now, here's just a little dashboard that I put together. It's, there's 3 of them, and I just called it CollectD. Now, what I did is I created a dashboard, and I added a widget onto it, and this just happens to be a line chart widget. We'll turn edit on, and we can take a look at this guy. And when you want to add data, what's interesting is you need to go over to widget settings, the gear, and here you can see the usual stuff in OCI, storage nodes, ports, all that neat stuff. However, let us go down to the bottom. Notice these 2 new beasts. And we'll go back and take a look at the file, and you can see where it got CPU and memory from, which is the default collected data when you install the script. These guys can now be added, just like any other metric, to your dashboard. You can use those and roll them up in different ways and filter them and do all the kinds of things that you do with a regular system. And you will notice that I started this the other day, and so I have some historical data. But here we go. This is what we could see. It's collecting data. It's there. It actually works. Now, some of you may say, oh, well, tell us how to use these metrics and what they mean and all that. Beyond what we're going to talk about today. Not only that, I myself don't know what they all mean because there are quite a few of them, as you can see. Not only do we have a specific metric, but we also have the submetrics associated with it. So there is quite a bit of useful information. And these imported data components are going to change depending on what you tell CollectD to bring back, and I'll show you a little bit about that in just a second. Okay, so that's how you use it, how you surface it in OCI. Beyond that, dashboard geniuses and all that, you guys know how to actually make that pretty and do that better than I do. So that will end the OCI UI part of it. I do think it's useful to take a quick look at, make sure I got my file location right. Let's see, get the package, get the token, here we go. I believe it's in here. Nope. Shoot. I don't have it. Well, I can find that out pretty quick. Hold on. Let's go back to back here and the original instructions. Okay, well, I'll just show it up here. This is created when Python uses that token to generate the installation. Mine will look exactly like this. I could go out to the server and bring it up, but since it's got it on the screen right here, this is just fine. You can edit this guy. It's in Etsy, init.d, CollectD is the file. And if you edit it and look at it, you can see that there's a number of things. Some of this you don't want to mess with. Some of it's obvious. The host ID, the token that you put in, the reporting interval every minute. Those all make pretty big sense. Plugins. Here's where, now I haven't played around with this a lot, but this is my understanding. If you have multiple plugins, you define here which attributes you want to have packaged and sent back to OCI. So if you have plugins for other components that have metrics associated with them, you have to add those in here at the plugins line, or they won't surface in the OCI UI. Okay. So back to PowerPoint. All right, that's it. I'm sorry how crude some of the demos and things were. I literally got bits and pieces of this working at the last hour. Hopefully this is useful. There's pretty much zero documentation on CollectD right now. That's something that NetApp and my cohorts obviously need to address. I learned pretty much all these little things through trial and error from doing the install multiple times. I'm hoping that this session will allow you to skip some of my mistakes and save yourself a few hours. This thing, the more I played with it, the more I realized just how much power there is behind this. There are dozens and dozens and dozens of plugins from which you can collect data. Now, I'm not sure all of that data is going to be meaningful in an OCI context, or some of the plugins may not work. Can't say I've tested them all, but the amount of potential information that you can pull in is just huge. This URL here that you see is a table of the plugins. There's, I don't know, I think there's some 60 of them. And that's not even all of them. That's just the official sanctioned ones. That, and based on what we've done here today, if you feel that you'd like me to write up real instructions, kind of an install manual proper, more than just a README, with some of these gotchas and things built in, that's a little more, shall we say, professional than my quick PowerPoint here, ping us. Let us know. Raise your hand. Tell Joy, yeah, I'd love to see some real instructions. And I may take the time to put that together, because this is a great little piece of code. It's just infuriating. Yes?
I missed one step. This is not a data source. How did you discover the host?
You don't discover the host. That's the interesting thing about it. It is not defined as a host. It is the push to the REST API defines this as incoming data coming in through the API. The host, I never defined the host at all for this. If
So
you
it
go
just
to
shows
data
up?
sources, what's that?
It just shows up?
Yes, it just shows up. And
shows up as-
trust me, Joe, I found that out the same way that you probably would. I went in and said, wow, when I created the dashboard and looked at the metrics that I could add, those entries were there. So no, there is no defining the host on this required.
So if it's not a host, how does it show up as?
Yeah, I know, that's a little weird. That's why I kept saying this is not a data source, because its behavior is not what you would think it would be. I struggled with that myself for quite a while.
Where do I see it again?
When you you got to put like a widget in your dashboard, and felt, well, what the heck? All right, Joe, I'll go back for your sake, and we'll take a look. Let's go to, this is my dashboard. I have put a widget on here. I just started out, make new dashboard, dropped a line chart widget on it, and notice the gear for where we modify what's in the widget and what data goes in. These are the ones you'll see on any OCI install, right? They're the defaults. But look here. Now we've got these two new metrics. And it's interesting because they're not tied necessarily to a data source, right? That's what's weird about this, is that they're kind of just out there for you to use. So you have to know where these guys came from, and that's why you put the descriptions and things in there, is so that you can.
So let's say that I have a dozen of hosts out there sending metrics.
Yeah.
How do I know where it's coming from?
How do you know where it's coming from? Good question. And honestly, that's something that I'll work on to answer and try and put in a further documentation on this. So,
okay.
You know, I'm learning like you are. So stump the chump, you win, Joe. You get a prize. I'm not sure in the details. I am pretty sure it comes from the description tag when you register the source with the token. I think that's where this data gets pulled from. I don't think I can do properties on this. Maybe I can. No, I can't. So that's a good question, and we'll try and get you an answer for that. Joy, remind me to get Joe an answer to his question on how I identify that and how I make them unique if I have multiple data sources, because that is, in fact, a very reasonable question.
So this works for Linux hosts, right? What about
yes, it is.
What about
Windows?
Systems? Windows.
Yeah, other operating systems. CollectD is available for other OSs, namely Windows and some various other things as well, but Windows most notably. The issue that we have right now is that the wrapper that wraps around the CollectD data that's absorbed has only been written for Linux at this point in time. So the support now is only on the Linux operating system. I have heard noises that we're going to add a Windows version, but don't quote me on that. I think that there may be a Windows version in the works. As for using CollectD on other things, like people have put it on routers and other minimalist systems, there's no Python wrapper for that. Now, if you wanted to be game and we were truly open sourcing this thing, which we should be, you should be able to take that Python wrapper and put it on whatever the target system you want is. So long as it's got Python support, it may very well work. But that would be an exercise left to the reader and would probably require at least a modicum of programming skills, which honestly are beyond on my capabilities at this point. Unfortunately, the list of supported Unix, Linux operating systems are all we've got right now.
Is there another way to collect from Windows hosts today using WMI or something like that?
Yes, you can. That's exactly right. WMI is another means to go at it, and that would probably suffice. WMI is great However, it does tend to be Windows and Microsoft app specific, so you can get data from applications through WMI from like SQL and things like that. But if you're using third-party apps that don't necessarily plug into the WMI providers and logging functions and things like that, you might find it somewhat more limited. But you are correct. There is a WMI connection for Windows that can be used as well.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Joe. Good questions. All right. Thanks as always. Bit players. Yeah, like I did all the work. No, not at all. Joy Allen, the face of the Customer Success Program, without whose help I probably would be asleep right now and you all be wondering where I was. So she keeps me in line. She is a primary contact for CSP information. If you want, I don't know, copy this presentation or something like that, schedule information, recordings, etc. She's the gal to talk to. The newsletter has her current contact information. I would have put it here, but I know Joy is trying to move to an alias rather than her direct name for CSP time, so that's why I didn't put it in. Kyle Kuntz, who's my sidekick partner, all-around helpful guy. He may be your CSP, Customer Success Program contact guy. I have a certain component of them, and Kyle handles the rest. He is a longtime NetApp guy, and he knows a lot more about things like ONTAP than I do. So if you have questions on like the NetApp simulator and things like that, he might be a good resource. Chuck Beckman is another partner of ours, similar to Kyle. Chuck handles many of our large enterprise accounts for the CSP program. And last but not least, my boss, Jay Carnley. He runs the CSP program. If you don't like something, or ideally, if you found this useful, and you really want to talk to the big guy, contact Jay. I would prefer that you contact him and tell him that this was wonderfully useful and that I am a valued employee and should be kept on regardless of economic conditions. But that's entirely up to you. All right. What time is it? 8:55. Not too bad. Didn't lose too many of you. Thank you so much. I know we had quite a few people. Obviously, there was a lot of interest in this topic. Like I said, I know this is a little crude, but I got to tell you, I think this is better than anything else you're going to find out there right now. We will work to address that because this level of documentation is not good enough for our NetApp customers. And that's all, folks. I appreciate you taking the time to sign in. The recording of this will be available. Joy will send out the information on that. Please keep reading our CSP newsletter, and thank you for your interest in NetApp and more specifically OCI. This was a lot of fun for me to put together. It had its infuriating moments, but I learned a lot, and hopefully you will learn a lot from this and from using CollectD as well. Thanks so much.
And thank you, Charles, for a very educational session. I'm going to stop the recording, but I will keep the line open for a few minutes in case anyone has a direct question for you.
Okay.